Okay, hello. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for joining this ICAS event entitled Asia's Future at a Crossroads, a Japanese strategy for peace and sustainable prosperity. My name is Benoît Hardy-Chartrand, and I am an adjunct professor here at Temple University teaching international affairs. We are extremely lucky today to have three great guests to present a brand new report that just came out yesterday. A report whose title I just named, Asia's Future at a Crossroads. This is a very important and timely report discussing Japan's role in this region. So we will start by having each speaker give brief remarks, and then we will open it up to the floor. And so please get your questions ready. And for those who are online on Zoom, thank you very much for joining in such large numbers. And please feel free to write your questions in the chat, and I will be passing them on to the speakers. I will briefly introduce the speakers before they start with their remarks. So we have, first of all, Professor Yoshihide Soeya. Professor Soeya is Professor Emeritus of Keio University, from which he retired in March 2020, after serving as Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the Faculty of Law for 32 years since 1988. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan in 1987, specializing in world politics. His area of interest are international relations in East Asia and Japanese diplomacy and external relations. Then we have Mike Mochizuki, he holds the Japan-U.S. Relations Chair in memory of Gaston Siger at the Elliott School of International Affairs of George Washington University. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Dr. Mochizuki received his PhD in political science from Harvard University and specializes in East Asian international relations and Japanese politics and foreign relations. And finally, we have Dr. Kuniko Ashizawa. Professor Ashizawa teaches international relations at the School of International Service, American University, and at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Her research interests include Japan's foreign policy, regional institution building in Asia, and global governance. She received her PhD in international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. So once again, thank you very much for being here. We look forward to hearing your introduction to this great report. So the floor is yours for your remarks.
Okay, I will start. Well, maybe division of labor among three of us. I will basically talk about general sort of sense of problems or even sense of mission of this project. And by first of all, referring to the national security strategy adopted by the government in December last year. And we see some fundamental sort of drawbacks in this approach, current dominant government approach, and then suggest a sort of alternative way of thinking and even a strategy in order to sort of cope with some of fundamental problems which we see arising from the current somewhat dominant approach and even concept of security. And the national security strategy emphasizes the current security environment being the most severe and complex since the end of World War II. And we don't quarrel with that. And I think that's okay. But what stands out in the sort of the government approach is, and even the dominant attitude and arguments among so-called security experts. And what stands out is a very strong emphasis on power politics including the military dimension of international relations and geopolitics, as well as economic security. And in response, the new security strategy stresses the centrality of Japan's self-defense capabilities and the U.S.-Japan alliance. But in retrospect, I don't want to spend much time on this, even though I like to as an individual in my approach to post-Japanese diplomacy and security. But in retrospect, Japan's post-war security policy until around 2012, I would say, did not embrace such an explicit geopolitical orientation. Those who have lived long enough should know this. Young people, I'm not sure. But on the contrary, post-war Japan consciously withdrew from the realm of power politics in international relations, if you will, and abandoned the notion of a required defense force in the 1970s and limited itself to a basic defense force to deal with small and limited acts of aggression. But the new security strategy marks a 180-degree turnaround, almost tantamount to a paradigm shift of Japanese security policy. However, this raises a fundamental question. To what extent is Japan really able to cope with this new geopolitical situation on its own? Answer should be obvious. Does anyone believe that Japan's national power is now greater than before in either relative or absolute terms? The answer should be clear no. One must conclude, therefore, that there exists a significant disparity between the paradigm presented in the national security strategy, on the one hand, and Japan's own capabilities on the other. This is a very simple way of describing the structure, but I think this structure is real in the paradigm of the recent government security policy. Accordingly, the U.S.-Japan alliance is deemed essential to fill this gap. And in that sense only, perhaps, there is an element of logical consistency in Japan's new security strategy. And accordingly, strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance ends up being the strategy's almost a priori premise, as well as its absolutely indispensable prescription. In short, Japan is stuck with the U.S. in this paradigm. What underlies the analysis and the recommendations in this report, of our report, is our serious concern that this new paradigm will not only lead to the collision course between US, Japan on the one hand and China on the other, but also will leave Asia entangled and divided in the future. So this is a central problem that we start from by sort of looking at the nature of paradigm shift in the current government approach. So alternative to this is none other than middle power diplomacy and middle power cooperation. And how this can be an alternative. Realistically speaking, we believe there are realistic elements to realize what we present as middle power approach. But the biggest obstacle is a mindset of security experts and policymakers. According to their mindset, they really believe in the current government security approach. And of course, assumption is China is the bad guy. We have to do something about it. That's it. And they don't go beyond this. And therefore, how to interpret, appreciate the nature of China challenge is not discussed so seriously and deeply. It's simply easily assumed that China is trying to destroy US-led world order, and it's going to create its own world order and regional order, and therefore it needs to be deterred. And I think this is a bit monotone argument for us. And so middle power approach, first of all, does not take it granted that, or first of all, middle powers cannot deal with this highly strategic, even military dimension of US-China rivalry. If China or US decides to go their own way, we are powerless, of course. But we have not done enough homework yet among ourselves, which is build up cooperation among ourselves. One simple analogy may not be analytically that helpful, but a simple analogy would be what European countries have been doing since the end of World War II between the Soviet Union and the United States. Alliance with the US is important, but building its own sort of autonomous regional grouping was another critical, objective. And Asian countries have not done that during the past decades necessarily. So a single country cannot, develop its own sort of strategy to cope with this highly strategic and sometimes very dangerous, bilateral relations between US and China. And so forming a group of one kind or another among these middle powers. Sometimes I use the term sandwiched nations or squeezed middle between US and China. And Japan is clearly there, together with other countries, including South Korea, of course. So these efforts to build up something out of our common sort of interest and common vision into the future and build up our cooperation, that was terribly lacking in our region. And so Japan putting energy and the focus of its strategy in this new domain, that's what we are arguing for, sort of as an alternative to security approach, whereby Japan will continue to be stuck with the US. And American on that, for that matter, is stuck with Japan, in order for US to carry out sort of credible, balance of power strategy vis-a-vis China. Japan is essential according to, their calculation. And so we are stuck with each other in one way or another. Nature of being stuck is somewhat different, but so that's the power of the US-Japan alliance for alliance handlers. And in our proposal, we are, for instance, in order to sort of highlight this, importance of sort of middle power cooperation. If you have a different mind framework reference, the way you look at the regional landscape will become, of course, different. And one example could be Quad, US, Japan, Australia, India. And according to the dominant, official security policy framework, Quad is regarded as US-Japan alliance plus Australia and India, perhaps. Naturally, it's taken as such. But if we take a middle power approach, perspective to this, this could also be viewed as Japan, Australia, India, plus US. And we are arguing that Japan, Australia, India should work together and lead the agenda setting of Quad. We have our regional interests, right, of ourselves. And then bring US in here. I think, this is our conceptual sort of approach. And if we take Quad as such, then Quad plus Alpha becomes somewhat different from the conventional way of looking at it. That is, if Quad is still being regarded as US-Japan alliance plus Australia, India, Korea, current government may not have that much difficulty, but the Korean consensus will not be created. But if Quad is viewed as Japan, Australia, India, middle power cooperation plus US, then Korea can join this middle power trilateral framework. So this is middle power quad. We use that term, India, Japan, Australia, South Korea can form a middle power quad, and work with the US on that basis, and work with ASEAN and other regional countries, in envisioning the future of an Asian order. So this is a concept that we are presenting, as an alternative to US alliance-led, way of looking at security, environment, and needs. If seen from that angle, the most important partner for Japan's middle power diplomacy should be none other than South Korea. Republic Korea is an established democracy and a developed economy. It has become one of the 10 largest economies in the world, and its per capita income matches or even exceeds that of Japan. And if Japan and South Korea can seriously cooperate, for the sake of regional stability and prosperity, kind of view of not only Northeast Asia, but entire Asia would be totally different. So it's a huge, huge opportunity cost that we are paying because of our sort of emotional entanglement with something about the past, not the future. So here, I think there are realistic potentials to move things ahead. But obstacle is emotional mindset. I wouldn't say current government paradigm is too emotional, but some emotionalism is there, or idealism of a sort. And so this is a huge obstacle. So to change that mindset, there is no other way than this sort of intellectual approach to encourage people to think differently than the current dominant, framework. So this is our sort of sense of mission, and this is how, specific arguments in the report are presented. So I'll stop here, and specifics will be presented by the rest of us. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Soeya. Dr. Mochizuki, please go ahead.
Great. Well, first, I want to thank you, Benoît, and the Temple University Japan campus for hosting and giving us this opportunine to present our report. And I want to thank all of you who came out to attend, and also those who are online. We really appreciate you showing an interest in our report. Professor Soeya gave, what I think is a brilliant critique of Japan's new national security strategy. But I want to just step back a bit to talk a bit about our original, to use it in Japanese, our original mondai-ishiki, our original problem consciousness, because we started this project 4.5 years ago with a retreat in Karuizawa in December 2018. That was 4 years before the national security strategy was adopted by the Kishida cabinet. And so our original problem consciousness was that when we asked the question, what really is the existential security threat to humanity? The answer was not North Korea. The answer was not the rise of China. But it was the challenge of global climate change and the consequences that we are already experiencing. So we are already in the middle of the climate crisis. And in order to deal with this existential challenge, it demands an unprecedented level of interstate cooperation. And many of us were appalled that there's been a fixation, a preoccupation, an obsession with great power competition. And there was very little effort given to interstate competition or interstate cooperation. And so one of the things that we were trying to do was to break out of the tyranny of consensus about great power competition and the dominant discourse that we see both in the United States and in Japan. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to find ways to promote regional cooperation and mitigate this U.S. China rivalry. Kevin Rudd had talked about having guardrails in the U.S. China relationship. And we felt that neither the United States nor China was capable of providing those guardrails. And that's why we came up with middle power diplomacy. And yeah, certainly, if U.S. strategy was the correct strategy, it might make sense for Japan to basically follow the U.S. lead. But we felt that, although China is a serious concern, there's a tendency to overinflate the threat from China. And as Susan Shork has said, the United States is overreacting. And that tendency is driving Asia to entanglement and division. So that was our Mondai Ishiki and our response to the basic question. And so we felt that one way of Japan helping to meet this problem was through developing a middle power coalition and while maintaining and strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance, the Japanese would be willing and able to influence the United States to move its policy in a better direction. Now, oftentimes we get a pushback when we make this point from our Japanese friends saying that, well, if Japan speaks up in ways that are contrary to U.S. policy, then won't the United States abandon Japan? So there's always a sense of insecurity among the Japanese foreign policy elite that there's really no choice but to follow the U.S. lead. But we question that fundamentally with the dramatic power transition that has taken place in the world with the rise of China, and despite the fact that the United States has many strengths, no one can deny that the relative power of the United States has declined from when it was at its peak in this so-called unipolar moment. So as Professor Soeya stated, the United States needs Japan more than ever before. And because of that, Japan should not fear abandonment as a consequence of speaking up and trying to develop a more equal U.S.-Japan alliance. And in fact, Japan has leverage vis-a-vis the United States. So that's our general approach towards the United States. The phrase that we've been promoting in the report is this notion of Shin-Bei Jiritsu, so being close to the United States, but still pursuing an autonomous foreign policy. Now let me get to some of the specific recommendations, and you'll see that some of these recommendations are quite controversial, and this is our attempt to kind of broaden the debate to break out of the tyranny of consensus. So first of all, in terms of Japanese defense policy, and that's recommendation number 7 on page 70, and our position is that certainly it makes sense, given the deteriorating security environment for Japan to build up its defense capabilities. And we endorse the efforts made by the Japanese government to enhance mobility, beginning to focus on the issue of base resilience and defense, dealing with cybersecurity, space security. We're all for that, and all of these things we see as being consistent with the so-called Shin-Bei or the strictly defensive defense doctrine. But where we part ways fundamentally with the Japanese government is in terms of counterstrike capabilities, long-range counterstrike capabilities to attack enemy bases, especially enemy bases in China. We feel that the deterrence benefits are quite limited, and there are huge negative side effects, and one being that to really have a robust, meaningful counterstrike capability against adversary bases, it would require a much greater investment and use of very limited defense funds for defense expenditures. And you're not getting the benefit, primarily because of the asymmetric nature of the geopolitical situation that China's in vis-a-vis Japan, with Chinese missile bases and air bases being dispersed through a vast continental space versus Japan being an island country. If Japan were to launch that kind of attack in retaliation, then Japan needs to think through then what would be the response. And if you get into that kind of exchange, then Japan is certainly in a negative, disadvantageous position. So we feel that the deterrence benefits of adversarial strike capabilities are relatively limited, and the negative consequences are great. But we do favor the acquisition of standoff counterstrike missiles that can be launched from the outer edges of China's anti-axis area, denial area, in order to interdict forces from China that may be launching a war of aggression against Japanese territory. And we see that completely consistent with Shin-Bei or defensive defense. Another controversial recommendation is recommendation number 9, which is on page 72. And of course, we all want complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization in North Korea, but because of decades of failed diplomacy, we are further from that goal than ever before. And right now, we just have no policy to stop the current trend. Deterrence isn't functioning as far as stopping the missile and nuclearization programs of North Korea. So what we advocate is a much more pragmatic approach that would follow a more incremental, step-by-step, reciprocal approach, starting first with a verifiable freeze of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Fortunately, I think both the Kishida administration and the Yoon administration has become much more flexible in terms of dialogue towards North Korea. The United States, I think, is hampered a lot by domestic politics and making a really meaningful approach towards North Korea. We also advocate Japan trying to resolve the abduction issue by setting up a liaison office in North Korea to follow through on the investigation of the abductees. And as part of a broad diplomatic effort, which would include ultimately normalization of relations with North Korea and developing a peace system, we could get a verifiable freeze of North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile programs. So that's another recommendation. Another issue is regarding Taiwan. And we see Taiwan as one of the most serious flashpoints in East Asia, and there's been a lot of discussion about this recently. Our view is that deterrence is important, but a policy that just focuses on deterrence is likely to be counterproductive and will increase tensions. Our basic position is that there's no way that we can change China's motivation to eventually have the unification of Taiwan with the rest of China. I mean, as long as the current regime is in place, that motive is not going to change. And so our policy should be to shape the intentions of China, to try to encourage China to be more patient, to stick to a peaceful approach to the issue of unification and kick it down the road as long as possible until at some point in the distant future, China and Taiwan can come to some kind of settlement through peaceful means. So that should be the ultimate goal of policy. So deterrence helps in that situation, but if you put too much emphasis on deterrence, it's likely to provoke China into thinking that time is not on China's side, and as the military balance shifts, there might be a greater tendency to think that, well, maybe a military force might be the only way to unify Taiwan with China. So we advocate a policy of reassurance as well as deterrence, and at a minimum, what we ask the Japanese government to do is to explicitly state that Japan does not support the independence of Taiwan. Even the United States has stated in writing in the National Security Strategy of the United States that the United States does not support the independence of Taiwan. But Japan still is unable to do that, and this is what's lacking in Japan's kind of reassurance diplomacy. Another controversial recommendation is regarding the Senkaku's dispute. I mean, I think you would all agree with me that the Senkaku issue has been one of the key issues that has worsened the relationship between China and Japan. We advocate building on the November 2014 set of statements from China and Japan that was used to kind of stabilize bilateral relations after the crisis of 2012 regarding the Senkakus. And while insisting that the Japanese position that it has territorial sovereignty over the Senkakus should remain, we feel that Japan should recognize that there is in fact a bilateral issue between China and flexibly respond to this issue and engage diplomatically with China to reduce tensions and ultimately to try to implement the June 2008 set of negotiations regarding joint development in the East China Sea. And this is a set of negotiations that not only Japan, but China has stated explicitly is still valid. And this would go a long way in stabilizing relations between Japan and China. And finally, I see that I'm pretty much out of time. The last recommendation I just wanted to highlight is regarding nuclear weapons and the negative trends that we now see in terms of a nuclear buildup. And we are, of course, very much concerned about the modernization and expansion of Chinese nuclear forces. But we also investigated what is the motivation behind China's nuclear modernization. And there are many factors, but one of the key factors is a response to the United States changes in strategic policy around the three triad of of not only nuclear forces, but conventional counterforce capabilities, plus the nuclear counterforce capabilities, and the development of a regional missile defense network. And the effect of this is that the Chinese feel that their second strike capability is being undermined. And there's almost unanimous consensus among security specialists who look at the Chinese nuclear program that that is the key motivator. Now, why is the United States interested in having this kind of strategic primacy? Well, there's many reasons for that, but one key reason is to reassure allies like Japan about the credibility of extended nuclear deterrence. And so in a sense, indirectly, Japan is kind of creating the conditions for the US quest and maintenance of strategic primacy, which is then leading to the reaction by the Chinese. And we wanted to break that causal chain by Japan urging the nuclear weapon states to adopt a no first use doctrine. And this is not something that just us in this research group has been advocating, but someone who has studied nuclear strategy deeply, like former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, has in fact advocated that. And we think it is in Japan's national interest to urge the nuclear weapon states to adopt the no first use doctrine. And in addition to that, we feel that Japan should participate in the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons as an observer. Germany has already participated as an observer, and Japan's historic importance because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki can play a bridging role between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. So we strongly advocate that the Japanese government follow Germany's lead, and this is again middle power diplomacy, and participate as an observer in the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. So I'll stop here and turn it over to Kuniko.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Mochizuki. Please go ahead, Dr. Ashizawa.
Okay, so it's a division of labor. So I'll be more focusing on that economic, the aspect of this policy proposal and this policy report. But before going to this detail on the economic recommendation of foreign policy, I just wanted to a little bit highlight the other uniqueness or important characters of this report or our study group. The Professor Soeya and Professor Mochizuki, they are the two really important co-conveners, so the leaders of our group. And then we have a total 11 scholars and then also former practitioners in this group. And then, there's really kind of distinct scholars on Southeast Asia or Russia, or even European specialists. So in one sense, we have a little bit broader kind of specialists and experts on beyond that kind of Japanese foreign policy specialist to discuss about the issue of the important question about what Japan should do vis-a-vis Asian, the Asia and the kind of regional political and also economic cooperation. Why we brought those kind of different the scholars, because we wanted to have a little bit more kind of substantive discussion on this question. And then, so we could have a little more established scholars here instead of me. But another important feature of this project, and then the conveners kind of selected, put the really conscious attention is to have a little bit gender balance for the participants, because in general, any reports for the Japanese foreign policy or strategy, you can see that those study group are primarily kind of consisting of the male specialists. But we wanted to again present our discussion outcome and this report as a little bit more new kind of way to look at the Japanese foreign policy. So we tried to have a little bit more gender balance in our study group. So we got the 3 female the scholars out of 11 the scholars in this study group. So just I wanted to a little bit highlight why I'm sitting here. And then also another things that I believe that would make this report is a little bit unique or not necessarily kind of conventional the presentation of this kind is probably you realized in this the order of the discussion. The economic issues indeed comes before the security discussion. Okay, so that we have a general discussion, the discussion on general approach, and then comes chapter 2, the economic, regional economics, the question. Then that follows by the security, regional security. Again, this is a very conscious choice that we did because in general, Japanese foreign policy or security, strategic kind of discussion, the security arena would come first, then economic, and then other issues follow. But we thought the economic arena is really important area for the Japanese, the government or Japan in general can indeed exert its quite unique leadership and also to realize what Professor Soeya and also Professor Mochizuki discussed as a middle power kind of network. Japan's playing as like a leading middle power kind of actors. And then also in this particular arena, Japan can also come up with some concrete measures to exercise the so-called Shin-Bei Jiritsu Gaiko. So closely associated with the US position, but in the meantime, try to have a little bit more autonomous policy. And then finally, we thought economic arena is also important because as Professor Soeya said in the beginning, one concern that we shared is that we really kind of want to avoid that the growing division or so-called like a bipolarity within the region, which would not benefit Japan also, and then also other many countries. Many countries in Asia would not want to have that Asia to be divided. And then since the economic arena, it engage in any diplomacy would tend to engage, particularly middle power diplomacy would engage, creating some kind of coalition or regional institution, multilateral institution, multilateral grouping frameworks to engage or tackle some of the challenges we are facing. So in that particular need of the creating groupings framework, Japan can again pay a little bit more conscious approach and to ensure that Asia would not be divided. And so that's the kind of the important reason that we put economic discussion before the security discussion in this report. And then based on that kind of the understanding of the importance of regional economics, we of course came up that the kind of basic principles, the underlying approach of what Japan should do vis-a-vis the regional economic foreign policy. And then we identified the 3 agendas Japan kind of need to pursue, and then also consciously to strike a balance between these 3 agendas. First agenda, still promoting economic liberalization, which definitely benefit the regional economic development, not just in Japan, but also many Asian countries. But in the meantime, we also came to really kind of keenly recognize that some of the negative impact that kind of see, came from this promotion of economic liberalization or globalization in general. And this is 21st century, so we came to see that some kind of negative social impact on those liberalization in some vulnerable population, not just in Japan, but also in Asia countries. And then this is a time to pay more attention to that, the negative social impact from this kind of exclusive economic liberalization, and also climate change, other the impacts also would kind of pay attention to. So the second the agenda should be promoting the kind of sustainable development goal agenda, and then to mitigate, to introduce measures to mitigate those negative social and also environmental impact of that, excessive economic liberalization. And then third agenda, we need to, of course, ensure that economic security. And then the Japanese government last year introduced that the new kind of economic security promotion law, and we agree that the importance of that, to pay more conscious attention to secure the economic security kind of arena, not just for in Japan, but also again the many neighboring countries or the other Asian countries. So there are kind of basic recommendation. It's just Japan needs to kind of consciously pay attention to those three agendas and then try to strike a balance between those three agendas, which is not easy. But we kind of need to highlight that importance of those, the balancing act for the Japanese economic regional foreign policy. And then as I said a little bit earlier, also Japan also need to be conscious about the principle of the open regionalism when it comes to that its economic foreign policy toward the region. Again, that ensure, we hope that it would kind of ensure that the Asia would be not kind of excessively divided by this kind of economic actions by the different countries. So having said, so based on those kind of underlying principles, we came up several recommendations in economic arena. But I would like to highlight two specific recommendations in this presentation. So the first recommendation I would like to highlight is the recommendation 4, which concerns about the free trade, promoting free trade or free trade arrangement. And then we specifically, in this kind of specific recommendation, we did look at what Japan should do with that relatively new free trade agreement, which is called Comprehensive Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it's called CPTPP. Or TPP-11, and which was established in 2018. And then probably some of you might kind of heard the latest news about CPTPP, to which the United Kingdom 2 weeks ago formally joined as a new member. So the original member was 11. US wasn't out. But the UK joined the CPTPP, and then now that many Japanese media kind of began to discussing about sort of who's the next, and then the countries or economies kind of on the next line is Taiwan, and then China, and you see that there's some kind of the discussion in media, Japanese media or US media, that maybe Taiwan should go first. Our position, first of all, the CPTP, we kind of appreciate the so-called high kind of standard of CPTPP when it comes to the free trade agreement. And then also Japan played a really important role at the really kind of last leg of the creation of CPTPP. So we kind of value the Japanese effort to realize CPTPP. So for that case, Japan should, we see Japan should also kind of focus, continue support expansion and then strengthening of the CPTPP. And then when it comes to this big question about China and Taiwan, our recommendation is to encourage both Taiwan and China to join simultaneously. The reason is we kind of value that the potential importance of China is participating in the negotiation of CPTPP. The accession negotiation, of course, would take time, but through that negotiation, we can also gather the information of the Chinese actual economic kind of policy. And then also, we understand that there is a kind of, even from the Chinese side, there is some need to introduce more drastic economic reform within their own countries. And then there are some quarters of the Chinese economists or policymakers who would indeed hope that the Chinese kind of accession to our participation of CPTPP would indeed kind of accelerate that necessary reform. And then the Chinese economic reform would not just benefit Chinese own economy, but also the regional economic actors, including the Japanese economic actors too. And then also thirdly, if the China and Taiwan both join the CPTPP, and this would give really one of the few the important the official venues that the government officials from Taiwan and then also China would be able to engage, and then again to continue, to exchange their kind of interactions. So for that case, we see that the benefit of China participating in CPTPP, and when it comes to Taiwan, it's really obvious that Taiwan is already ready. Their economy is ready to join CPTPP, and then also given that the long-standing relationship between, particularly the economic relationship between Japan and then Taiwan, there's no reason for Japan to oppose Taiwanese participation in CPTPP. And then there's a big challenge on how this ensure both China and Taiwan to join CPTPP, because it's when it comes to the political reality, if Taiwan joins CPTPP, as many observers currently suggest, then China would not join CPTPP because of their political position. In case if China would join CPTPP and then then they would block Taiwanese participation. So we have long discussion about this, and pros and feasibility also we discussed, but we concluded in a discussion that at least at this point, Japan should aim to promote the idea for the China and Taiwan simultaneously to join the CPTPP. And so that's one, the proposal number 4. Okay, and then another proposal we came up is that something related to economic security. So number 6, recommendation number 6, we did try to come up some the concrete proposal when it comes to the rule making of digital economic sector. Because this is a little bit, it's quite a new arena in even the economic regional governance, and then that associated with this new the concept of the concerns about economic security, and because of that, there have been a lot of discussion of the rule making or making standard of the use of digital economy, and then also ensure that those data data transfer, be it in a more global the framework of OECD or WTO, and then also regional framework. And then one the prominent the framework which we came to observe is a U.S.-led the IPEF, so the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which was launched by the President Biden. That concerns not just the digital economy, but also supply chain and then other issues. But the IPEF definitely start looking at the creating new rules and then also standard within the IPEF members. Japan played a really important role to realize this IPEF framework, an Indo-Pacific economic framework. But as you know, the IPEF is a framework that indeed is viewed as contain or a little bit oppose the China's economic expansion and activities in the region, which means the IPEF doesn't include China. So that's a one kind of framework, regional kind of a framework in economic arena that kind of start emerging. So our recommendation is, since Japan played an important role to the launch of IPEF, so it should continue engaging the discussion for the rule making of the digital economy. In the meantime, there's another really interesting development in this particular arena, which was a kind of more like a bottom-up kind of initiative by Singapore, and then Chile, and then New Zealand. And in those three countries in 2020, they established that the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, which is called DEPA, that's really exclusively focusing on the rule making of the digital sector. So only three countries kind of established this framework. So it's kind of a little bit, there's a kind of reminiscence of what happened, the original kind of TPP creation. And then since then, there are a few countries which in Asia which already kind of put forth their application joining DEPA. And then one was South Korea. And then South Korea recently formally kind of joined DEPA. So, and then other countries like Canada and also China put forth their formal kind of the application to join DEPA, Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. So from our perspective, to first of all, this kind of middle power diplomacy, but also ensuring that the Asia would not be divided, we decided to recommend that the Japanese government also should start seriously looking at that potential possible application or joining this DEPA agreement. So this is the kind of I just wanted to mention two important recommendations in these economic arenas.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our three speakers for this very comprehensive introduction to this report. We have just about half an hour left, and I already see four questions in the chat. There are people in the room as well. I'm going to try to alternate between people who are in the room and those who are online. I have a few questions of my own, but I'm going to skip them in order to prioritize those numerous questions that are already here. I will start with the question online because it was already there since the beginning of the presentation. So just hold on a second. This is a question from David Wagner. So Japan's defense policy is the most independent in the post-war period, yet still heavily dependent on the United States for its defense. There is talk that if Trump were to regain office, he may wish to reduce force or even pull them entirely out of Japan. And in such a case, what could Japan do? Can anyone of you?
In that hypothetical situation, I think Japan will inevitably push more toward working with other Asian friends, the regional countries. So middle power approach will become much more urgent. But of course, without the US, we are powerless, vis-a-vis China, if China decides so. And so it's important to change their intention, that's what Mike just talked about. But in that hypothetical situation where Trump comes back and pulls out US forces significantly, I think the need for us to work with other Asian countries would be greater. But this is a good news for China, I'm sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Which is why you're actually advocating for the continuation of close collaboration with the United States.
Yeah. And then the one important critical subject matter for middle power networking is to talk about the US and have a regional consensus as much as possible as to the role of the US. I think the US is going to be critical, even for this middle power approach. But nature of criticality is somewhat different from the current, dominant security paradigm. I mean, so that's another important point about this. Yeah. So if Trump does that, I think the need for Japan to talk to other agents about the U.S. and to engage U.S. Out of our cooperation would become a real issue. Yeah.
Great, thank you
So
very
Japan
much.
shouldn't take it as a sole issue for Japan alone. We should have a regional perspective to this issue as well.
Great. I'll take a question from the classroom. I will bring you the microphone so that the people online can hear you. So I don't know if that can reach you. Yes, it should be able to reach you.
Sensei Tachi, thank you very much for your presentation and congratulations on the completion of your project and its very successful launch here in Tokyo. My name is Mark Davidson. I'm a former senior foreign service officer of the Department of State, a former faculty member of the U.S. National War College. I'm now in the private sector and I serve on the Board of Overseers of Temple University, Japan, so welcome. I haven't had the chance yet to read your entire report, but listening to you talk tonight and just glancing through the recommendations, and I'm sure this is an overly simplistic understanding, so I'd like to ask you to correct me. In aggregate, it seems that many of your recommendations amount to a series of concessions or even appeasement vis-a-vis China. Throughout history, aggressive states have sought to divide and conquer and seek triumph in that way. Shin-Bei Jiritsu Gaiko sounds like a great concept. But again, I come back to the sense that I get, again, just from a very superficial reading over the past few minutes of your recommendations, that you attribute tensions and risk in the region more to the solidarity of the Western-oriented, democratically oriented countries rather than China. And I think, particularly in recent months, not a day has gone by without reminders of the nature of the Chinese regime, whether it be the crushing of democracy and dissent in Hong Kong, the disappearance of their own foreign minister, or extremely risky and provocative unprofessional maneuvers by their naval and air forces. So I'm getting the sense that you're blaming the good guys and that the only way to peace is for us to appease the aggressor, which I think history has shown is not in the long run a wise policy. So please correct my overly simplistic understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I hope you read the report because, I mean, certainly in our presentation, we gave a critique of U.S. foreign policy, but throughout the report, we make pointed criticisms at China and how China is a problem. And we push back on things about China. I don't think that we are advocating a policy of appeasement, but we're trying to find a way of stabilizing the situation given the realities of China. Of course, if we can all wave a magic wand and China became a full-fledged liberal democracy that wasn't engaged in economic and military coercion, that would be great. But we also see the danger of a overreaction to this, and if there is a military conflict between the United States and China, it would be devastating in the region. And so we're certainly not advocating appeasement, but we want smart diplomacy to stabilize the situation. But throughout the report, there are pointed criticisms about the Chinese political system and Chinese behavior.
Yeah, and we definitely introduced or recommended some of the so-called, the Japan would cooperate or should engage some interaction with China. And then we thought about this could lead to some kind of behavioral change within China. Of course, it will be difficult and probably it will be long term. But this is something we thought maybe we should even, first of all, try to think about how we can change the Chinese thinking and behavior. And one way to come up with this kind of or small kind of recommendation can lead to that, potentially that kind of behavioral change in China. And then that we thought that would be one way to indeed bring a little bit more stable kind of intra-regional relations in Asia.
Thank you very much. I will now move on to a question by Paul Mitford online. So Paul, thanks you for your badly needed initiative and the policy recommendations. So there are two brief questions by Paul. So one, in the report on page 45, you state that a Chinese attack on Japan is unimaginable outside of an attack on Taiwan. But what about a Sino-Japanese military conflict emerging out of the ongoing confrontation over the Senkakus? So that's the first question. And the second one, related, can we trace this hawkish transformation of in Japan's defense policy to the new status quo of continual confrontation with China over the Senkakus since 2012? So those are the questions by Paul.
Since I've been looking very closely at the Senkaku situation for quite some time, and really looking at the interaction between Japan and China since 2012, when the Japanese government purchased 3 of the Senkaku Islands, I think the dominant narrative about the Senkaku issue is misguided. Now, certainly after 2012, the Chinese engaged in very, very coercive behavior. But in terms of the long-term trend over the last decade, it's been of stabilization and what I would call a state of fragile restraint between China and Japan. Now, the dominant narrative has been that China is escalating tensions. But in fact, I was just in Okinawa and I heard that the person that was retiring as the head of the Coast Guard in Ishigaki, the Japanese Coast Guard, said he did not sense any escalation. Now, to the extent that there is escalation, it's because during the COVID pandemic, local fishing vessels started to go back into the territorial waters of the Senkakus, right in front of Chinese Coast Guard vessels. And so the Chinese, if you're a captain of a Chinese Coast Guard vessel, you would not be doing your job if you did not tail the fishing boats, because they could fear that the fishing boats might land on the Senkakus and cause another crisis. And so that's what's led to the slight upswing. But generally, there is stability. And so I know that the Japanese are concerned that China is about to make an attack on the Senkakus and seize them. But I don't think that that is, really a high probability thing happening. So I'm much more concerned about the consequences for Japan of a military conflict over Taiwan.
Thank you. Continue to try to go through as many questions as possible. We have about 20 minutes left. So the gentleman here in the middle.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating to listen to you. I'm Shamshad Ahmed Khan from India, but I'm based in Dubai. I teach at one of the Indian university there. I'm a student of Japanese studies, so I have been following Japanese domestic policies as well as security policy from, I think, is over a decade. I did my PhD in 2010. Anyway, so it was, I have 2 questions, one for Professor Soeya Sensei, and another one for, of course, Mike Mochizuki. To you, sir, you said one important point that in terms, even though Japan is number 4 economy now, number 3 in terms of GDP, and Korea is number 10, but Korea has overtaken Japan as per capita income. So, and when we talk about, and you had this thing that even though the Japanese security policy intent has changed to 180 degrees, that if I quote you, but it does not have the capability, the money or wherewithal. So when we discuss this thing, of course, there is high inflation in Japan now. And I read so many stories in Japan Times and other newspaper that people are postponing to getting married. And we have a scenario where Japan's population is going down. So when we talk about this security, did you ever contemplate security for whom? Security for what? Now coming to you, sir, it seemed that if I don't see you and I just turn my face that side, it will seem that Hatoyama is sitting here, former Prime Minister Hatoyama sitting here, who suggested that there should be at least, Japan should accept that there's an issue. Senkaku is an issue between the two countries. But it sparked lots of debate. However, it is interesting. Of course, I appreciate that a conflict is resolved or the two parties sit together only when they accept that it's an issue between them. It has happened between India and Pakistan on the issue of Kashmir. At least they say that there's an issue. In between China and India, they say that it's an issue, so they want to resolve. They sit on the table. In Japan case, when one party is not acknowledging that is an issue, other party says that it is mine, it will aggravate. Second thing about your very interesting point that this this first strike principles. On the one hand, there is a debate in Japan, which you might be aware of by reading the articles which is coming from, especially from those who are close to the administration. I was reading a piece of Koichi Hamada, the former security advisor, economic advisor of former Prime Minister Abe, Yale University, and Professor Emeritus. He says that Japan should go for nuclear sharing. On the other hand, you are suggesting that Japan should focus for no first use fallacy. So how to find a balance between the two views? It is Japan who scuttled Obama's initiative to announce no first policy.
Was there a question to me?
Yeah, I was saying security for whom and for
Oh,
when
given Japan's objective sort of situation.
Yeah.
But here we are now talking about international security, right? International politics. But Japan used to advocate comprehensive security, and which included domestic aspects of Japan's, existence and prosperity. But now our arguments are overly taken away by our concern about China and North Korea. But if your point is that Japan may be facing more serious security issues domestically rather than externally, that may be correct. But they are on different sort of level of analysis, so to speak. And I myself is worried about the future of Japanese economy. How to get out of the sort of current framework of economic policies, created and established, firmly embedded of so-called Abenomics. Way out is terribly difficult and awfully dreadful. Just a 1% rise of interest rate would make our national budget totally can't think of. I don't want to think about it. I think that's what people's attitude. But anyway, but of course our report is about external thing, and maybe this is good opportunity to if I may respond to Dr. Davidson's point, I think we also share the view that many of the problems come from the rise of China and the Chinese challenge. And to me, I tend to, argue, there are a bit of argument, some part of the report of this nature also. I think it's what China does and say is somewhat reminiscent of Chinese imperialism, sinocentrism. It is a psychological, aspect of Chinese external thinking and behavior, which is now time has come for China to come back to the center of Asia, as it used to be. I think that mentality is there, leadership and even population. Therefore, China believes taking back Taiwan for them is a natural progress of their trajectory of becoming a great power and even extending to South China Sea. And so it's a huge problem. But maybe so we are proposing an alternative way of dealing with these Chinese challenges by the assumption, on the basis of the assumption that the current dominant approach may not be necessarily constructive. I think that's what we're trying to do, yeah. So it's not appeasement, as I might say, yeah.
And I have a very quick answer to your question. So you talked about how do you strike the balance between these kind of extremes. Now, I understand Professor Hamada's position about Japan going nuclear. I didn't understand at all, your conception of the extreme that you saw represented by former Prime Minister Hatoyama. But I would say our report, the entire report is an effort to strike the right balance in the middle.
He said, but it created uproar within Japan. But you are putting it from the scholar side, at least depreciating. When he said this thing, it was quite, when Hatoyama said he was retired, at that time, he said that Japan and China should talk because there's an issue between them, So for the first time, somebody said that Senkaku is a bilateral issue. It's not a unilateral issue.
Yes.
And that
Right.
time it has two debates within.
Yes, but that's why we refer to the November 2014 statement of well, it's not a joint statement, but parallel statements between China and Japan, which in a sense de facto recognizes that there is indeed an issue between the two countries.
But we are not saying this is a sovereignty issue.
Right.
As a sovereignty issue, our position should be firm. Yeah. But there is a political, diplomatic, or whatever issue between the two. Yeah, that's our argument.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions left. Let's hope to go through all of them before the end of the session. I have a question online from Lionel Fatten. So Lionel is asking, again, it's related to the Japan-China relationship, which is looming very large in this conversation. Lionel is talking about Japanese economic and security engagement of China, which has been one of the two key pillars of Japan's China policy for decades, the other one being deterrence. The 2022 National Security Strategy notes that Tokyo still seeks constructive, stable relationship with China, and we have seen this continuing, for example, with the recent hotline being activated. But don't you think that Japan's greater emphasis on the deterrence pillar is threatening this engagement pillar and the sustainability of Japan's overall China policy? So that's the question. And how should Japan recalibrate its policy towards China, in your view?
As Mike said, we are not denying the sort of value of deterrence, which should be there. The point is, if our approach is viewed as deterrence only, that is very counterproductive. But as the question said, I mean, I think it's partly because of the fact that the document was released under the Kishida administration. Our diplomatic sort of engagement with China is also there. And I think that's very positive. And so it's a matter of balance. It's a matter of balance. And if deterrence is viewed as sort of too central in Japan's approach, that doesn't help. But that doesn't mean that deterrence doesn't exist, right? And the other point is we have to think, as I said previously, about these issues more from a regional perspective and even global perspective as an issue simply for Japan or simply between Japan and China. And what are issues between Japan and China are also critical issues for the regional countries as a whole. And I think that's what middle power approach implies, I think.
Great, thank you very much. We have a question here in the room.
Yeah. My name is Hiroshi Meguro, and I'm a journalist, and I cover mainly Okinawa. And thank you very much for your very interesting report. And I had three questions, but probably the time is very limited, so only one. Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, I have a question for Professor Soeya. And you suggested a new type of Quad, Japan, Australia, India, plus South Korea. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting idea, but it seems a little bit loose partnership kind of thing. And because, Australia is quite dependent on the U.S. and South Korea is also. But in the case of India, we have an Indian friend, so which is more familiar with it. But India is quite independent, and so it's not easy to, form a kind of group, very very strong group, who's propose kind of policies to involve the U.S. necessarily. So what do you think?
Well, basically we have to ask Indian people, about this. But our take is India engages in omnidirectional diplomacy. And this middle power quad could be part of their omnidirectional approach, if not entirely. I think India has come into our picture for a long time now, in the Pacific. And then India is also interested in coming into the regional, architecture, I would think. And in India, of course, is not so happy about Japan being stuck with the US. And also, therefore, this, India, Japan, Australia forming a kind of middle power trilateralism, I think, I would think India would buy it, don't you? And in a way, it's a sort of establishing our own sort of, basis of engaging the US. And if Japan and the US is so close, that could be a problem for this sort of thing. And that's my take. So policy-wise, I think there are some aspects with which India can join this, if not again entirely. India is, as you said, independent and omnidirectional. It's a member of Shanghai Organization, and also it has some good relation with even Russia, and increasingly with US these days, and Japan as well, right? And it's making overtures to ASEAN, along the way of ASEAN Way, and so partially we can engage in India along the line of our thing. That's my take. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. One other question online, and maybe time for one more in the classroom after this. This is a question from Takao Takahara, who would appreciate a comment on the recent story regarding the idea of NATO opening an office in Tokyo. Do you have any views on whether or not this would be a good idea or not?
It will be simple. Politically, this is important, but militarily, not that much. Like,
I would agree with that, and I don't think politically is necessary. So I'm probably a little bit, less enthusiastic about the office.
Have any views, Professor Ashizawa?
I think I'm a little bit more close to Professor Mochizuki about this position.
Let's try to go with maybe one last question here in here. A short question. Here is the microphone.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It's very informative. Since you were talking global and even more worldly, you started this in 2018. Is that correct? When you got together, right? So my question is, now with Russia invading Ukraine and all of that happening, and it's more sort of towards the end of your analysis, I'm just curious, how has that impacted or affected your thoughts on what you put together now or possibly going forward? Because that's very scary, what we see now. Thank you.
So in fact, during the pandemic, we continued to hold regular meetings on Zoom, and especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we take a firm position on that we condemn the Russian action as a violation of international law and all the norms. We also emphasize in the report that it shows that you can never take security for granted, and that's why we see the importance of being prepared and having deterrence. But we also see that we should not learn the wrong lessons from this. And although Vladimir Putin is to blame for this war, we also need to recognize that since the end of the Cold War, an opportunity was lost to stabilize the relationship with the former Soviet Union, the Russian Federation. And one part of this had to do with the eastward expansion of NATO, all the way to a serious consideration of Ukraine. Starting with Boris Yeltsin, this was seen as something that went against Russia's core interests, flashing red lights, the Germans and the French warning this. So it's not to absolve the blame of Vladimir Putin, but there was a strategic context that was created that made it more likely for what happened with the invasion. And so we should learn that lesson as well and not create the kind of strategic context that China, because it has its core interests about Taiwan, ends up attacking Taiwan. I think there's a real misuse of the term appeasement here, but almost every political scientist would agree that if you've got a rising power, if you want to maintain peace, there has to be a certain amount of accommodation of its core interests. And in the end, I'm a firm advocate of preserving Taiwan's democracy, but a war over Taiwan is not the way to preserve Taiwan's democracy, and it's through diplomacy, and I think that's the lesson we should learn from the tragedy of Ukraine.
If I may, this Taiwan thing. Of course, we are also against the unilateral use of force by China. That should also be explicit and obvious. And as to the wrong lessons that maybe we have learned from Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine, I just mentioned two things, which I mentioned in the report. One is about China-Russia axis. I think, they are very close to each other as long as U.S. is a common obstacle to their own sort of strategic interest in Europe for Russia and in Asia for China. But for Russia, Europe is the main theater. And for China, Asia is the main theater. I don't see serious, sort of alliance between China and Russia in both of those theaters. So we shouldn't overemphasize this axis, as far as Chinese ambitions in Asia is concerned. And that's one thing. And secondly, a little bit of a different nature. Many Japanese security experts are arguing that heaven helps those who help themselves. Therefore, Japan should pay more efforts in self-help. Otherwise, international society may not help as they are helping Ukraine. They are helping Ukraine because they are fighting. And I think that's a wrong lesson for us because we are not, scenarioizing in reality and as a realistic, scenario, China invading Japanese homeland. What we are seriously concerned about is the military clash over Taiwan and how it's, kind of expand into some other, territorial things. And I don't think China will attack Senkaku for the sake of Senkaku. If something happens over Senkaku, it's part of Taiwan contingency, I would think. So that's how we need to be prepared. And then, as I said, as far as Taiwan's strategy of the U.S. is concerned, U.S. is stuck with Japan. We hear many simulations coming from the U.S., and many of them say, if Japan doesn't do anything, U.S. is going to lose, right? For U.S. to win, Japanese help is essential. So they are stuck with Japan. And so as far as Taiwan contingency is concerned, I think heaven helps those who have helped themselves doesn't work. I think that's a wrong lesson. But I detect the intention, which is to justify Japan's increase of defense budgets and so forth. I think to me that comes from domestic imperatives rather than strategic imperatives for many policymakers. I would have to argue.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sadly, we are out of time. I wish I could have gone to the other questions and comments that are online, but I will share them with our speakers. So once again, thank you very much to our large audience online and those who came today at Temple University, Japan. If you want to remain informed of our events, please join our ICAST mailing list. And please join me in thanking one more time our three wonderful speakers for the presentation of this great report. So Professor Soeya, Mochizuki, and Ashizawa, thank you very much.